Sup, you fuck posers? Wait. Welcome to the world of gaming. We live in an era of stunning visuals, incredibly tight mechanics, and microtransactions in games we've already paid for.
Beautiful, isn't it?
And not every release falls into that trap, but true gems are getting harder than ever to find. And with new titles dropping every week, it's easy to forget the classics that paved the path we now walk. While some deserve to collect dust for eternity, others went overlooked, underappreciated, and never really got their time in the spotlight. That's where this series comes in. We dig into a game's history, gameplay, and whether it's worth adding to your collection. Today, we step back into gaming's golden age and revisit Todd McFarlane Spawn, the video game. 3 decades later, does it still hold on its own? Or is it just a relic of the chaotic comic boom of 1993? Welcome to Under the Spotlight. The year is 1991, and rising star Todd McFarlane is making a name for himself in the offices of publishing titans DC and Marvel Comics. It had been nearly 2 years since he joined writer David Michelinie on The Amazing Spider-Man, and well over a year since he'd been granted full creative control on his own wildly popular standalone series, Spider-Man. But despite the acclaim and his growing popularity among a significant amount of fans, tensions were mounting between McFarlane and several of his colleagues, artists, and superiors alike. To make matters worse, some readers felt his writing didn't quite measure up to what was typically expected from a Spider-Man story. To them, it was sloppy, clumsy, and frequently came off as obnoxious or even pretentious. And riding the coattails of that criticism, several individuals at Marvel began voicing their own concerns, telling higher-ups that they felt the tone and subject matter of McFarlane's stories were far too dark and depressing for Spider-Man's audience. This only added more pressure. The creative control McFarlane had been given began to feel like a farce, a distraction meant to appease him while he churned out comics under the Marvel banner. This made him feel like he'd been backed into a corner. Although Todd owed much of his rise to the doors opened at Marvel and held a deep respect for the legacy of Spider-Man, by the end of 1991, his long-held frustrations were beginning to quickly surface. What once felt like creative compromises now felt like barriers. The restrictions, the mandates, the lack of real control, it was all becoming harder to ignore. And he wasn't the only one starting to feel this way. A growing number of high-profile artists at both Marvel and DC believed their creative potential was being stifled. 6 individuals, already stars in their own right, believed they had reached the limits of what they could achieve within the existing system. So together, right under the noses of the publishing titans, these titans of industry were beginning to imagine something different. A new age of comic book storytelling. They were planning regime change. So in 1992, Todd McFarlane, along with Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, Mark Silvestri, Eric Larson, Will Portacio, and Jim Valentino walked away from the 2 biggest publishers in comic book history, and in doing so, founded what would become one of the most influential comic book publishers of all time, a publisher called Image Comics. The 7 agreed that Image would serve solely as a platform for artists to publish their work while retaining full ownership and creative control, rather than surrendering their creations to the publisher, and they quickly backed up that mission statement with action. It took little time for Image to gain momentum. The founders had years worth of pocketed stories and ideas, and now nobody to tell them no. Image Comics released its first title in April 1992 with Rob Liefeld's Youngblood to overwhelming support. The comic sold 930,000 copies on pre-order, breaking the record at the time for the highest selling creator-owned title by an independent artist. But that record wouldn't last for long. Todd McFarlane had spent years facing criticism for unapologetically trying to break the mold Marvel had clung to for decades. The creation of his own publishing house became the perfect avenue not just to explore the highs and lows of his creative vision, but to finally chase a dream he's held onto since childhood. Though it may not have been an offer sheet from the Blue Jays,
Timlin, Nixon bunts, Timlin on it, throws to first. For the first time in history, the World Championship banner will fly north of the border.
it was a story Todd had been waiting to tell since the day he first picked up a pencil. A story about the tragic fall of Al Simmons and the redemption of Spawn. Just 1 month after the release of Youngblood, in May of '92, Todd McFarlane released Spawn #1, and not only did it compete with the success of Youngblood, it absolutely shattered the record set, selling over 1.7 million copies. Spawn claimed a crown he has never had to forfeit and a throne he has never had to leave, holding the record for best-selling independent artist-owned comic to this day. Despite its darker themes, the series resonated with both older and younger readers alike. Fans on both ends of the spectrum dreamed of seeing their favorite Hellspawn brought to life, whether on the silver screen or the television in their living rooms. But to the dismay of many, those voices fell on deaf ears, until one fateful day in 1995. 3 years after his debut, Spawn had proven he wasn't just a fluke, but a force to be reckoned with, and the publishing giant Sony ImageSoft had taken notice. Acting on their behalf, Acclaim approached Todd to begin discussions about bringing Spawn to life beyond the pages of a comic book. And in true Sony fashion, the best way to do that was with a video game. Released in October 1995 exclusively for the Super Nintendo, Todd McFarlane's Spawn brought players exactly what they craved. Gritty side-scrolling action with platforming to boot. Beat-em-ups were everywhere back then, but few matched Spawn's pixel-perfect style, moody tone, and hellish flair. And that's not the only thing that makes Spawn stand out among its substantial competition. Gameplay is also surprisingly involved for a Super Nintendo title, offering a wide variety of damaging moves, challenging platforming sections, and genuinely satisfying general combat. It also features incredible, pixel artwork, and I believe it holds a meaningful place, not just in the legacy of Spawn, but in the broader history of gaming itself. But we'll talk about that last one later. If you've been watching the channel for a while, you're probably wondering why McFarlane's Spawn is back in the spotlight, since I already covered this game just over a year ago, and the reason is simple. I don't think I gave the game a fair shot. The tricky thing is that you never quite knew what to expect. Gaming in the 90s and much of the early 2000s was a very different experience compared to what we see in 2025 and onward. While some games offered a steady difficulty curve, more often than not, their core intent was to push you to your limits, whether by challenging your puzzle-solving skills, stretching your mastery of a combat system, or demanding precise timing across tricky platforming sections. The Golden Age was about putting the player to the test and rewarding them for rising to the challenge. Though some may argue the opposite, games back then weren't necessarily harder, it's just the devs didn't assume you were gonna be a smooth-brained little bit. Upon starting the game, you're greeted with a beautiful pixel art splash screen as Spawn pans into view, and the title card flashes onto screen as if magically conjured by Spawn. But not before you're hit with one of the worst jump scares in gaming. I can't wait to play this. This actually looks pretty good. This looks pretty good. It's okay. It's okay. They only published it. The now defunct Japanese studio Ukiyote, known for their work on the Super Nintendo's Hook, Skyblazer, and Todd McFarlane's Spawn, wastes no time with introductions here. From the moment you start, it's clear this game is all about Spawn, and that's thanks largely in part to the incredible pixel artwork, particularly in how they brought Spawn himself to life. Whether he's walking, bare-knuckle boxing a thug's ears in, or or casting one of his many spells. Spawn is beautifully animated, often feeling like a three-dimensional character existing in a two-dimensional space. And wait until you see his cape animations. Like, this has got to be one of the best looking Super Nintendo games of all time. But as beautiful as this game can be, there's just as much working against it, and I'd argue that those flaws completely ruin any chance McFarlane's Spawn had at becoming a solid Super Nintendo experience for the wider gaming audience. One of the first and most damaging flaws, in my opinion, is the inconsistency in enemy difficulty. Most of the basic enemies you encounter will typically fall after 1 to 3 hits, depending on the enemy type and the move you use. While some enemies can be annoying to deal with, nothing ever really feels unfair or wildly unbalanced when it comes to just the general combat. Once you get used to the system, fighting wave after wave of grunts feels less like a chore and more like an opportunity to execute your hits with as much comic book flair as possible. To be honest, it's actually a lot of fun. But what isn't fun is the absurdly difficult boss fights. The first boss you face is the cyborg Overkill. His attacks are lightning fast, his health bar is massive for a first level encounter, and his hitboxes are wildly inconsistent, a problem that plagues nearly every boss fight in the game. Like many players, you might find yourself struggling so much that you simply give up on trying to progress through the game altogether. What should feel like a fair, manageable challenge instead turned out to be a frustrating, nonsensical nightmare. The unfortunate part is that he's actually an insanely easy boss to defeat. In fact, every boss is. This game is stupidly easy, but you'd never know it if you grew up with the game because the solutions are far from intuitive. Very few players stumbled upon proper strategies by pure chance, and most reviewers either gave up after a dozen failed attempts or offered tips that were no more effective than lacing up the shacks, sending it, and praying you make it to the end. In other words, outside help was useless! If you're one of the many people who played this game and failed to see it through to the end, let me be the first to say it's time to dig it out of the attic and give it another try, because the solution is literally this. I kid you not. The trick to beating every single enemy and every single boss in this game is 3 moves: your side jump attack, your standing jump attack, and your sliding attack. That's it. With a few tries per level just to make sure you have the proper timing down, every single boss can be taken out with a handful of well-timed hits, even the ones that were deemed most problematic to a casual run. Inevitably, you're going to take a few hits because without pixel-perfect execution, the game still suffers from irregular, inconsistent hitboxes that feel like they change at random during boss fights. Sometimes you'll just happen to take damage when you shouldn't, or because a move that just landed a moment ago suddenly phases right through, leaving you to chew rocks instead. And while that would usually be a huge problem, especially with the rarity of health packs in the game, along with the variety of physical moves you have available, you also have a handful of Spawn spells at your disposal. The best part, they've been available the whole time! The game just never tells you. And better yet, there's no menu to display the input-specific special abilities. And unless you have the original manual on hand, your odds of discovering them are slim to none, because they're just as reliable as the dog water hitboxes and near impossible to accidentally trigger. While it's fair to argue that this isn't entirely the game's fault, it's hard to ignore the fact that an in-game move list or any sort of menu could have easily solved this issue. Yes, reading and studying a game's manual was a big part of the experience in the 90s, often because they contained critical information like Spawn special moves. It's also a major handicap. Manuals are easily lost, damaged, or never included with secondhand copies. I just happen to get incredibly lucky, but that's not always the case. And once a game is separated from its manual, the quality of the experience drops off a cliff. especially McFarlane Spawn. Without the manual or some prior knowledge of these spells, there's no reason to believe Spawn even has special abilities, let alone how to use them. So, for the sake of you enjoying this game to its fullest extent, here are the 8 special moves present in Todd McFarlane's Spawn as they appear in the game manual. The first power, Tinkerbell, is activated by holding the right trigger, pressing down, then pressing A or Y. It launches an enemy-seeking projectile that explodes on contact or when manually detonated by pressing A, X, or Y. Second is the ever-important Heal Yourself. To activate it, hold the right trigger, press up, then down, and quickly release the trigger. With the correct timing, Spawn will restore a significant amount of health. Spawn's third power is Burning Fist. To perform it, hold the right trigger and press right-left or left-right. Then press the left trigger or X to cause Spawn to unleash a powerful punch in the direction of your final directional input. Fourth is Fire Blast. To perform it, hold the right trigger and roll your thumb from down counterclockwise to right. Then press the left trigger or X to cause a burst of flame to erupt from Spawn's body and engulf any enemy in its path. His fifth power is Full Force Blast. To activate it, hold the right trigger and roll your thumb from down clockwise to left. Then press the left trigger or X to make Spawn unleash 4 fireballs that seek out enemies and deal heavy damage on contact. Sixth is Firestorm. Hold the right trigger, roll your thumb counterclockwise from left to right, then press A or Y. Spawn launches upward in a roaring flash of fire, dealing significant damage to everything in his path. His second to last power is Searing Fist Blast. Similar to Firestorm, hold right trigger and roll your thumb counterclockwise from right to left, then press A or Y. Spawn will this time extend his arms and unleash a powerful blast that damages everything on screen. And lastly, his teleportation. This power is activated by holding the right trigger, rolling a full counterclockwise circle from up back to up and pressing A or Y. Thankfully, it also triggers automatically if you misstep and fall off of a platform, saving you from an untimely death. And that's it. But as fun as these powers can be, both visually and mechanically, the unfortunate reality is that 7 of the 8 powers are practically useless in a casual playthrough. Now, if you're somebody who's played it a lot, you might think I've lost my mind for saying that, and you'd be right, just not for the reason you think. Spawn's powers do make the game's difficulty far more manageable, and in some runs, they're actually quite critical to a successful playthrough. But the problem is that the inputs required to activate most of these abilities are so specific and the timing so precise that without hours upon hours of practice, you'll often end up dying simply because you couldn't pull off a clutch fire blast or land the heal you desperately needed in time. Admittedly, with enough repetition, executing these moves does become easier, but that's the issue. Most players just don't have the time or simply don't care enough to grind through hours of input practice just to reliably use Spawn's special abilities. And without that consistency, there's little incentive to even bother trying pulling them off at all. For most of my playthroughs, especially the ones used in this video, I stuck with the combination of Spawn's side attack, jumping attack, and slide attack, occasionally mixing in the upward jumping punch, performed by pressing up and X because of this. The only time I ever used a special power was to heal, because trying to pull off an entertaining chain of spells was often more punishing than simply landing a few well-timed jumping kicks. If, like me, you're mostly looking for a semi-challenging beat-em-up experience, the special powers can largely be ignored and the game still enjoyed, so long as you're comfortable with its core combat mechanics. But on the other hand, if you do want to put in the time to get comfortable with the spell system, I think it's absolutely worth it for one simple reason. This game has insane potential as a speedrunning title. Even out of the box, with a decent grasp of the mechanics and playing it the same way I do in this video, McFarlane Spawn isn't a long game to beat. You could easily run it back 4 or 5 times in a single afternoon, with a full playthrough taking at most around an hour. But with enough time and practice and enough skill to consistently cast all of Spawn's spells on demand, it can easily become a sub 30-minute adventure, offering fast-paced, challenging combat wrapped in a legendary visual style. Despite my initial belief that this was an unbalanced, frustrating mess of dog water, I've come to see it differently. Todd McFarlane Spawn is a game that I believe is largely misunderstood. Beneath its mask of unrelenting difficulty lies a fairly rewarding challenge for those who, like Spawn himself, refuse to back down until they reach the end. At the end of the day, Todd McFarlane Spawn is an experience that admittedly isn't for everyone. But just because you don't plan on playing the game doesn't mean that you wouldn't consider collecting it. And should you? Truthfully, I think you should. No matter your intent with the game, whether play it or just simply collect it. Todd McFarlane Spawn is by no means the perfect game. And admittedly, like I said, it's not a game for everyone. Though I do stand firm on this being among the best looking games for the Super Nintendo ever to be released, its gameplay does leave a lot to be desired. It's an experience that can be incredibly fun, but issues like unexpected difficulty spikes and inconsistent spellcasting inputs can make it an overwhelming, frustrating mess for the majority of those who do choose to play it. But despite the flaws that have weighed it down since 1995, I believe this is a game that some collectors and players could easily enjoy. For just $25 Canadian and $18 US at the time of recording, Todd McFarlane Spawn offers far more in value than what sellers are currently asking for. Even though it is far from a perfect game, I think it's definitely one that's worth seeking out to physically own, especially for that asking price. While it's not exactly a grail by any means, McFarlane Spawn holds notable historic value, not only within the legacy of the Spawn franchise, but also for its ties to the early days of Sony Computer Entertainment. Though Acclaim ultimately published the game, it was by all accounts a Sony-born project. Prior to the PlayStation's launch in 1995 in North America, Sony released titles under the Sony ImageSoft label, and McFarlane Spawn was likely intended to debut under that banner. However, following internal restructuring, Sony dissolved ImageSoft and folded its operations into the newly formed Sony Computer Entertainment, leaving publishing duties largely to Acclaim. Of course, without any official confirmation, this remains speculation, and we may never know the full story behind this game's development. But given that one of the very first things you see when booting up the game is Sony Electronic Publishing, though we may never get a definitive answer, all signs point to Todd McFarlane Spawn being the final game developed under the banner of Sony ImageSoft.